The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for sharing his remarks. Mr. Speaker, on this International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, I want to share with the House a fresh clarity in my understanding of racism. Specifically, that racism does not begin with attitudes about members of an identifiable group, but rather it begins with economic oppression. I am a fan of podcasts, perhaps not surprising given that I worked for so long in radio, and podcasts are basically radio whenever you want to listen to it. And I binge listened to an excellent series called Seeing White by the Centre for Documentary Studies this January. It is clear that race is not a biological fact. The difference in the color of our skin tells us no more about our abilities or our character than differences in our height or our shoe size or our eye color. The first time Black people were described as such was in the mid-15th century. Africa is, of course, the cradle of all civilization and many different and distinct cultures. But in the mid-15th century, Black people were described as a group by a chronicler of a slave auction. The writer was paid by the enslaver. Prejudice rationalizes and justifies oppression. How could one enslave people without believing them inferior? In Canada, how could we take the land of Indigenous people without believing them inferior? And in Nova Scotia, how could we give Black loyalists poor, rocky land far from good ports without believing them inferior? Attitudes, prejudice justify the unequal treatment. And then, in a perpetual, perverse loop, some use poor economic and social outcomes as evidence that, see, the prejudice is justified. On the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, we must challenge attitudes in our society that perpetuate inequality. That is work for all of us, but that work will be woefully inadequate if we do not change the economic, social, and legal policies that structure the lives and opportunities of African Nova Scotians, Mi'kmaq people, and other people of color in our province. Thank you to the many people and organizations, both within and outside government and in communities across Nova Scotia, who are engaged in that work.